In the frozen depths of the Ardennes forest during the first days of January 1945, the echoes of the Battle of the Bulge finally began to fade. The snow-covered landscape was a testament to the ferocity of the fighting. Shattered trees stood like broken sentinels. Abandoned German tanks lay half-buried in drifts, and the ground was littered with the debris of war. Helmets, rifles, and the occasional frozen body of a soldier who had fallen in the desperate struggle. Hitler's last major offensive in the West had been stopped cold, not by superior German strategy, but by the unyielding resistance of Allied troops who refused to break. The Wehrmacht's panzer divisions, once poised to split the Allied lines and reach the Meuse River, were now in full retreat, their fuel depleted, their ranks decimated, and their momentum irretrievably lost. For the American soldiers who had borne the heaviest burden of this unexpected assault, the end of the battle brought a profound mix of relief, exhaustion, and grief. Units like the 101st Airborne Division, surrounded at Bastogne for days under relentless siege, had held out against impossible odds, their famous reply to the German surrender demand, "Nuts," becoming a symbol of defiance. Along the northern shoulder, the U.S. First Army had been caught off guard. Divisions scattered and commands disrupted in the initial onslaught. Thousands of young Americans lay dead in the snow, victims of the bitter cold as much as enemy fire. Frostbite claimed limbs, and the casualty lists grew longer with each passing day. Official figures would later confirm over 80,000 American casualties, killed, wounded, captured, or missing, the highest toll in any single battle of the war for the United States Army. In makeshift field hospitals and rear area billets, survivors gathered around stoves, sharing cigarettes and stories of the chaos. They spoke of the confusion in those first hours when German infiltrators in American uniforms sowed panic, of roads clogged with retreating vehicles, and of the raw courage that turned the tide. Pride in their accomplishment was real, but it was tempered by anger. At the intelligence failures that had missed the buildup, at the higher command that seemed unprepared, and at the sheer cost in American lives. This was their battle, they felt. They had stopped the Germans through sheer grit, buying time until reinforcements arrived. Across the ocean, the American press and public reacted with a surge of patriotic fervor, mixed with outrage. Newspapers like the Chicago Tribune and the New York Times ran front-page stories highlighting the heroism of GIs in the snow, portraying the Bulge as a triumph of American fighting spirit over Nazi desperation. Editorials demanded accountability for the surprise attack, and letters from families poured into Congress, mourning sons lost in a forest far from home. The narrative took firm root. The Battle of the Bulge had been an American victory, paid for in American blood. In Britain, the perspective was different. Shaped by years of solitary struggle against Germany before America's full entry into the war. The British public, weary from the Blitz, rationing, and the long grind of conflict, craved signs that their forces still mattered in the final push toward victory. The press noted the contributions of British units in the north, XXX Corps stabilizing lines, Canadian forces assisting in the cleanup. But some columns subtly criticized Eisenhower's broad front advance, arguing it had overextended resources and invited the German counterstroke. There was a quiet undercurrent of resentment. Britain had sacrificed disproportionately for years, only to see American manpower and material dominate the theater. At Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force in Versailles, France, General Dwight D. Eisenhower stood before his wall maps, tracing the shrinking salient with a measured gaze. The Kansas-born Supreme Commander, known for his diplomatic skill as much as his strategic acumen, had navigated the crisis with calm resolve. He had authorized bold moves, Patton's lightning relief of Bastogne from the south, the stubborn defense in the north, and now the maps showed Allied forces converging to erase the Bulge entirely. Yet Eisenhower knew the victory was fragile. The Germans had come perilously close to disrupting the entire Western Front. One of his most controversial decisions during the crisis had been made on December 20, 1944, temporarily placing the U.S. First Army and Ninth Army, part of General Omar Bradley's 12th Army Group, under the command of Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's 21st Army Group. The salient had severed communications between Bradley's headquarters in Luxembourg and the northern forces. Montgomery's setup in Belgium offered better coordination. It was a purely operational necessity, Eisenhower insisted, to grip the northern shoulder firmly and prevent further German penetration. Bradley, the steady, unassuming commander from Missouri, had accepted the transfer with outward grace, though privately it stung. His armies, American armies, under British command, even temporarily. He understood the logic, but it grated against national sensitivities already strained by months of debate over strategy. In Zonhoven, Belgium, at Montgomery's tactical headquarters, the field marshal reviewed the latest reports with satisfaction. Known for his meticulous planning and unyielding confidence, Montgomery saw the battle as validation of his methods. When he assumed control, he later recalled, the situation was sticky. American units fighting valiantly, but in disarray. He had reorganized defenses, built reserves, and orchestrated the counterattacks that blunted the German drive. This was crisis management at its finest, Montgomery reflected as he paced his map room. Swift decisions, clear command, that's what turned potential disaster into defeat for the enemy. His staff observed the field marshal's mood with a mix of admiration and concern. Montgomery was buoyant, almost triumphant. He spoke freely of how he had headed off the Germans, then seen them off, and soon would write them off. His chief of staff, Major General Francis de Gingand, a skilled diplomat who often smoothed Montgomery's edges, noted the growing self-assurance. De Gingand had urged caution in public statements, aware of the sensitivities involved. On January 6th, Montgomery informed his team of his intention to hold a press conference the following day. He wished to clarify the battle's narrative, rebut British critics who blamed Eisenhower for the initial setback, and present a unified Allied front. To Montgomery, it was an opportunity for honesty, blunt, factual honesty. The press has been full of nonsense, he told Brigadier Edgar Williams, his intelligence officer. I want to put the record straight and defend Ike. Williams hesitated, sensing the potential pitfalls. Sir, perhaps it's best left alone for now. Others echoed the warning. Montgomery's phrasing in private briefings often carried a patronizing tone toward American methods. Brave soldiers, yes, but needing firmer direction. In public, that could ignite a firestorm. But Montgomery dismissed the concerns. Clarity required directness. He would speak the truth as he saw it. The conference room in Zonhoven filled on January 7th with correspondents from Britain, America, and the Commonwealth. Flashbulbs popped as Montgomery entered. Barrett perched precisely, voice crisp and confident. He spoke for nearly an hour, praising American courage while detailing his own actions. As soon as I saw what was happening, he declared, I took certain steps myself to ensure that if the Germans got to the Meuse, they would certainly not get over the river. I employed the whole available power of the British group of armies, he continued, and I was able to ensure that the enemy's plan failed completely. The words flowed steadily, laced with first-person assertions. To Montgomery, it was an accurate recounting, a commander explaining how order emerged from chaos. The reporters' pens flew across notebooks. In the room, a subtle tension built with each eye. British journalists nodded approvingly. Americans shifted uncomfortably. As the conference concluded, Montgomery believed he had achieved his goals. Unity emphasized, facts stated, Eisenhower shielded. But dispatches sped across wires. Within hours, British headlines celebrated Monty's victory. American reactions brewed darker. In the field, generals like Patton seethed. Soldiers felt their sacrifices diminished. Bradley read the transcripts in stunned silence. The enemy had been stopped. The alliance was about to be tested. The decision that set the stage for the crisis had been made 3 weeks earlier, in the frantic darkness of late December 1944, when the German offensive was still surging forward, and the Allied line in the Ardennes threatened to rupture entirely. On December 19th, Eisenhower convened his senior commanders at a guarded schoolhouse in Verdun for what would become one of the war's most pivotal meetings. The room was cold, the maps grim, the salient was widening by the hour, American units were reeling, and reports spoke of entire divisions cut off or overrun. Eisenhower, chain-smoking and outwardly calm, listened as his generals reported. Patton promised he could swing the Third Army north within days to strike the southern flank. Hodges, commanding the battered First Army, described a situation that was holding, but only just. Bradley, whose 12th Army Group controlled both the 1st and 9th Armies on the northern shoulder, admitted that the Bulge had severed his direct communications with those forces. His headquarters in Luxembourg was now south of the penetration. Orders were taking too long to reach the fighting units. Montgomery, invited as commander of the neighboring 21st Army Group, had sent his chief of staff, Freddy de Gengen, but he himself submitted a written appreciation that arrived during the meeting. In it, he urged immediate unification of command on the northern shoulder under a single headquarters, his own. He argued that only this would allow rapid coordination, the building of reserves, and a firm grip on the crumbling line. Eisenhower already knew what had to be done. The geography of the Bulge made unified command essential. Bradley's armies north of the salient were effectively isolated from his control. Montgomery's headquarters in Belgium had intact telephone lines, better intelligence links, and proximity to the critical sector. Reluctantly, but with the clarity of a supreme commander who placed operational necessity above all else, Eisenhower announced that, effective immediately, the U.S. 1st and 9th Armies would pass temporarily under Montgomery's 21st Army Group until the shoulders of the Bulge could be joined once more. The room fell silent. Bradley's face tightened, but he said nothing. Patton muttered something under his breath about British cheek. Eisenhower looked directly at Bradley and spoke quietly. "Omar, this is only temporary. It's the only way to stop them reaching the Moose." Bradley nodded. "I understand, Ike, whatever it takes." Privately, the decision wounded him deeply. Bradley was not a flamboyant general. He was methodical, loyal, and deeply proud of the armies he had led from Normandy across France. To surrender operational control of two of them, even briefly, to a British commander felt like a public diminution. American newspapers had already begun speculating about the surprise attack. Questions were being asked in Washington about preparedness. Now this. Yet Bradley swallowed the humiliation because the war demanded it. He told his staff later that night, "We'll get them back as soon as the situation allows. Until then, we fight under whoever can win." Montgomery received the news with satisfaction, though not surprise. He had expected the transfer and immediately set about reorganizing the Northern Front with his customary energy. Staff officers from his 21st Army Group arrived at American Corps headquarters bearing detailed orders. Reserves were concentrated, defensive lines straightened, counterattack plans drawn. Montgomery visited forward units, speaking to American soldiers with his clipped precision, praising their courage while issuing instructions that left no room for debate. To the British Field Marshal, the arrangement was logical and efficient. He believed American command had been too decentralized, too willing to accept risk along a broad front. Now, with authority in his hands, he could impose the set-piece discipline that had served him so well at El Alamein and in Normandy. "The Americans fight magnificently," he told de Gengen, "but they need a firm hand to channel that energy." American commanders in the North accepted the new reality with varying degrees of grace. Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges of the 1st Army, a quiet professional, cooperated fully. Major General William Simpson of the newly arrived 9th Army did the same, but resentment simmered beneath the surface. Staff officers noted the tone of British liaison teams, helpful, certainly, but carrying an unmistakable air of superiority. Montgomery's habit of referring to the Northern forces as "my armies" in private briefings did not help. As the counteroffensive took shape in early January, the arrangement bore fruit. Montgomery launched a deliberate attack on January 3rd with British and American formations, pinching the tip of the salient while Patton hammered from the south. The meeting of the two forces at Houffalize on January 16 would finally erase the Bulge. Operationally, the temporary command transfer had worked exactly as Eisenhower intended. Yet, the political cost was mounting unseen. British newspapers, starved for good news after years of secondary role, began to emphasize the role of Montgomery and the 21st Army Group in restoring order to the front. Some accounts spoke openly of how British direction had saved the day after the initial American setbacks. In London, questions in Parliament praised Montgomery's decisiveness while subtly criticizing Eisenhower's strategy. In the United States, the same reports provoked anger. Congressmen demanded explanations. Newspapers that had initially downplayed the crisis now highlighted the heavy American casualties and the fact that 2 U.S. armies had been placed under foreign command, an arrangement unprecedented in American military history. Stars and Stripes carried restrained but pointed articles noting that the fighting had been done overwhelmingly by American troops. Eisenhower watched the growing friction with alarm. He had always understood that his role was as much diplomatic as military. The Anglo-American alliance was not a marriage of equals in 1945. American manpower and resources dominated, yet British experience and prestige still carried weight. He issued statements praising the cooperation of all nationalities, but he knew words alone would not suffice if tensions continued to rise. Montgomery, focused on the battlefield, remained largely oblivious to the undercurrents. He believed the press would eventually recognize the facts, that unified command under his direction had stabilized the North and enabled victory. When Degengen cautiously raised the issue of American sensitivities, Montgomery brushed it aside. "They know I'm right," he said, "and when the battle is won, they'll thank us for it." Bradley, back in effective control of the center as the Bulge contracted, waited patiently for the formal return of his armies. He had not complained publicly, had not leaked his frustrations to the press. But the memory of that Verdun meeting lingered. He had accepted the operational necessity. He would not accept having the sacrifice of his soldiers publicly diminished. By January 6th, as the last German resistance crumbled, Montgomery prepared to speak to the press. He saw the conference as a chance to set the record straight, to defend Eisenhower from British critics, and to describe accurately how the battle had been won. Eisenhower's staff urged caution. Bradley's headquarters remained silent, watchful. The temporary transfer of command had been operationally necessary. Politically, it had become radioactive. January 7, 1945, dawned cold and clear over the flat Belgian countryside near Zonhoven. At Montgomery's tactical headquarters, a converted hotel surrounded by pine trees and guarded by military police, the press room had been prepared with military efficiency. Rows of wooden chairs faced a simple table draped in khaki cloth. Correspondents from the major British dailies, American wire services, Canadian papers, and neutral countries filed in, stamping snow from their boots and lighting cigarettes against the chill. Flashbulbs charged, notebooks opened. The atmosphere was expectant. Few battles in the war had carried such drama as the Ardennes, and fewer still had ended so recently. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery entered precisely on time, beret tucked under his arm, uniform immaculate. He placed a single folder on the table, though he would not refer to it. His voice, high-pitched and clipped, carried easily to the back of the room without amplification. He began with measured praise for the American soldier. "Let me tell you first that the American soldier fought with the greatest gallantry and courage," he said. "He is a very brave fighting man indeed, and the whole world admires him for what he did in this battle." The reporters nodded approvingly. This was the tone they had expected. Allied unity, shared credit. Montgomery continued, describing the German plan in crisp tactical terms, a bold thrust to the Meuse, the splitting of the Allied armies, the hope of forcing a negotiated peace. He explained the initial surprise, the severity of the crisis, the danger that the Germans might reach the river and cross it. Then the tone shifted, almost imperceptibly at first. "As soon as I saw what was happening," he declared, "I took certain steps myself to ensure that if the Germans reached the Meuse, they would certainly not get across it. And I carried out certain movements to meet the various possibilities that might arise." He detailed how he had concentrated reserves, straightened the line, and prepared a counterstroke. "I employed the whole of the power of the British group of armies on the left flank," he said, "and I was able to ensure that the enemy plan failed completely." The phrases landed steadily. "I took certain steps, I formed reserves, I was able to head him off, I then arranged to write him off." The first-person singular recurred again and again. To Montgomery, it was merely factual. He had indeed been the commander making those decisions. He believed he was clarifying events, defending Eisenhower from British critics who blamed the broad front strategy and giving credit where it was due. But in the room, the American correspondents began to shift in their seats. One exchanged a glance with another. Pens scratched faster, not just recording words, but capturing implication. When Montgomery concluded with warm words about Eisenhower, a great friend of mine, and expressed confidence in final victory, the applause was polite but uneven. Questions followed, mostly from British reporters seeking tactical details. Montgomery answered briskly, then departed. Within minutes, the correspondents rushed to the telephones. Dispatches flew across the wires. By evening, the first British headlines appeared. Monty stops the Germans. Montgomery's masterly handling of the battle. British power turns the tide in Ardennes. The Daily Mail ran a banner. Monty says, "I headed them off." The tone was exultant, feeding a public hungry for British triumph after years in America's lengthening shadow. Across the Atlantic, the early editions hit American newsrooms like a shell burst. The Associated Press and United Press wires carried Montgomery's quotes verbatim. Editors in New York and Chicago stared at the phrases, "I took certain steps, I employed the whole power of the British group, and felt the sting." By morning, American headlines roared back. Monty claims credit for Bulge victory. British general takes bow for American battle. GI's blood, Monty's glory. The Chicago Tribune, ever blunt, editorialized, "The Battle of the Bulge was fought and won by American soldiers. Let no one rewrite that history." In the field, the reaction was visceral. At Third Army headquarters, George S. Patton read the transcripts and exploded. "That son of a bitch," he reportedly thundered to his staff. "My boys died in the snow while he sat on his ass in the north, and now he claims he won the goddamn battle?" Patton's contempt for Montgomery was long-standing, but this felt personal, an erasure of the brutal fighting his army had endured to relieve Bastogne and drive northward. At 12th Army Group, Omar Bradley sat alone in his office. The wire report spread across his desk. He read Montgomery's words once, then again. The praise for American courage was there, yes, but buried beneath layers of self-attribution. Bradley had accepted the temporary loss of his armies without protest. He had watched his men bleed in the forests while command passed to another. He had waited patiently for their return. Now this public reframing felt like the final indignity. He believes he is stating facts, Bradley thought, but he is claiming ownership of a victory paid for almost entirely by American lives. Bradley called in his Chief of Staff, Major General Levin C. Allen, and began dictating a letter. It was not a protest to the press. Bradley disdained public controversy. It was a letter of resignation, addressed to Eisenhower. Calmly, methodically, he outlined his reasons, that he could no longer serve effectively if the sacrifices of American soldiers were publicly minimized by an Allied commander. He did not demand Montgomery's removal. He simply offered to step aside, believing his departure would force the issue into the open. He did not send it, not yet. He sealed it and placed it in his drawer. But its existence became the quiet threat that would soon hang over the entire command structure. At Chafe and Versailles, Eisenhower's staff monitored the unfolding storm with growing alarm. Cables from American correspondents, clippings from British papers, angry messages from Marshall in Washington, all converged on the Supreme Commander's desk. Eisenhower, who had spent the war balancing national prides and strategic imperatives, recognized immediately the danger. This was not a tactical crisis. It was existential. If American opinion turned against the British partnership, if Congress began demanding changes in command, the entire coalition could fracture at the moment it stood poised to invade Germany itself. He summoned his Chief of Staff, Bedell Smith, and British Deputy Tedder. "This is worse than the battlefield," Eisenhower said quietly. "On the battlefield we know the enemy. Here we're fighting ourselves." Montgomery, back at Zonhoven, remained strangely serene. When de Gingen urgently brought him the first American headlines, the field marshal scanned them with mild surprise. "They've misunderstood," he said. "I praised their soldiers highly. I was merely explaining what happened." De Gingen pressed him. "Sir, the tone, the repeated I, it sounds as though you alone saved the day." Montgomery considered this, then shook his head. "Rubbish. I was the commander. Of course I took the steps." He thought he was explaining victory. He was rewriting ownership. By January 8, 1945, the storm unleashed by Montgomery's press conference had escalated into a full-blown command crisis, threatening to unravel the delicate fabric of the Allied partnership at its most vulnerable moment. Dispatches from American correspondents flooded SHAEF with urgent warnings. Generals were furious, soldiers felt betrayed, and public opinion in the United States was turning hostile. Eisenhower's inbox overflowed with cables from General George C. Marshall in Washington, conveying the War Department's concern that the controversy could erode support for the European theater just as the final push into Germany loomed. Omar Bradley, the epitome of restrained professionalism, had reached his breaking point. In his headquarters at Namur, Belgium, he revisited the resignation letter he had drafted the previous night. The words were measured, devoid of rancor, but unequivocal. He could no longer command effectively if the narrative of the Battle of the Bulge continued to diminish the role of American forces. Bradley had always prioritized the mission over personal glory. He had deferred to Eisenhower's decisions, coordinated seamlessly with Patton, and accepted the temporary subordination of his armies without public complaint. But Montgomery's words crossed a line. They did not just claim credit. They implied that American leadership had faltered until British intervention saved the day. Bradley summoned his key aides, including Major General Allen, and informed them of his intent. "If this stands," he said quietly, "I will tender my resignation to Ike. It's not about me, it's about the men who fought and died under my command." He did not leak the letter to the press. Bradley abhorred such tactics. Instead, he forwarded a copy through secure channels to Eisenhower, accompanied by a personal note emphasizing that his departure would highlight the issue without fracturing operations immediately. The letter remained unsent in its final form, but its shadow loomed large, a silent ultimatum that forced the Supreme Commander to act. Eisenhower received Bradley's communication on the morning of January 9th and felt the weight of the alliance pressing down on him. He paced his office in the Trianon Palace Hotel, maps of the Rhine crossings forgotten for the moment. This was not a crisis of logistics or enemy action. It was one of perception and pride, amplified by the press and impossible to counter with divisions or airstrikes. Eisenhower had built his career on coalition warfare, mediating between strong-willed subordinates like Patton and Montgomery. He admired Bradley's steadiness, called him the GI's general, and knew that losing him would be catastrophic, not just militarily, but politically. If Bradley goes, Eisenhower thought, the Americans will demand Montgomery's head. And if that happens, the British will revolt. The whole structure collapses. He convened an emergency meeting with his inner circle. Bedell Smith, his American chief of staff, Air Chief Marshal Arthur Tedder, the British deputy, and other key advisors. The discussion was tense, voices low to avoid eavesdroppers. Smith argued for a direct reprimand of Montgomery, perhaps even his relief. Tedder defended the field marshal's intentions, insisting the words had been misconstrued. Eisenhower listened, then decided on a multifaceted response. First, he would confront Montgomery personally, demanding an explanation and a public clarification. Second, he would appeal to higher authority, directly to Churchill and Roosevelt if necessary, to contain the damage. Eisenhower dispatched a sharply worded cable to Montgomery that same day. "Your press conference has caused immense harm. American commanders are deeply offended. You must issue a statement praising their role unequivocally and avoiding any personal claims." He followed it with a phone call, his voice steady but firm. "Bernie, this isn't about facts, it's about how it sounds. We've got to pull together, or the Germans will be the winners." Montgomery, at Zonhoven, received the message with genuine bewilderment. He gathered de Gingand and Williams, reading the cable aloud. "Offended? I praised them repeatedly," he protested. "I said they were brave fighting men. What more do they want?" De Gingand, ever the mediator, explained the cultural gulf. Americans heard condescension in the British understatement, erasure in the emphasis on I. Montgomery pondered this, his inflexibility warring with loyalty to Eisenhower. He drafted a response defending his accuracy but agreeing to tone down future statements. He did not grasp the depth of the injury. To him, it was a misunderstanding, not a betrayal. Meanwhile, the press war intensified. American newspapers ran scathing editorials, with one calling for Montgomery's removal. British outlets countered defensively, accusing the Yanks of ingratitude. In the ranks, American soldiers circulated clippings, their morale dipping despite the victory. One GI in a rear area camp reportedly quipped, We bled in the Bulge so Monty could have a press conference. Patton, never one for subtlety, fired off a letter to Eisenhower suggesting he tell that prima donna to shut his trap or I'll do it for him. Eisenhower's dilemma deepened. He could not publicly rebuke Montgomery without alienating the British, nor could he ignore Bradley without losing American trust. He began drafting contingency plans, restoring Bradley's full command immediately, restricting Montgomery's public utterances, perhaps even sidelining him for the Rhine crossing. But such moves risked open rupture. Across the Channel, in London, Winston Churchill monitored the crisis with growing alarm. His military secretaries brought him stacks of clippings and intelligence summaries. Churchill, the architect of the alliance, understood its fragility better than most. He had forged the special relationship through sheer will, dining with Roosevelt, corresponding tirelessly. Now, a single ill-phrased conference threatened it all. He summoned Alan Brooke, the chief of the Imperial General Staff and Montgomery's mentor, for counsel. Brooke defended his protégé but acknowledged the peril. Churchill decided to prepare a public intervention, a speech to Parliament that would reaffirm unity, distribute credit broadly, and subtly chide any overreach without naming names. He dictated notes to his staff, praise for American valor, British steadfastness, Eisenhower's leadership. "We must not let victory be poisoned by recrimination," he muttered as he worked late into the night. Bradley waited in Namur, his resignation letter still unsigned but ready. He conferred with Patton, who urged him to stand firm. "Don't let the limeys steal our thunder, Omar," Patton said. Bradley nodded but held back, trusting Eisenhower to resolve it. Eisenhower, sleepless, weighed his options. A direct order to Montgomery for retraction, a joint press release, appeal to Marshal for political cover. Each carried risks. The alliance teetered. No shots fired, no ground lost, yet the fracture lines widened by the hour. The war could survive Germany. It might not survive pride. January 11th, 1945 dawned grey and damp in London, but inside the House of Commons the atmosphere crackled with anticipation. Winston Churchill rose to speak on the war situation, his voice gravelly from cigars and sleepless nights, his words chosen with the precision of a man who understood that alliances are held together as much by rhetoric as by arms. The chamber was packed. Members knew something momentous hung in the balance. For days, British newspapers had trumpeted Montgomery's role in the Ardennes, while American dispatches had grown increasingly bitter. The Prime Minister had waited just long enough for the fury to peak, then stepped in as the only figure with the stature to bridge the widening gulf. Churchill began slowly, praising the Red Army's winter offensive in the east, then turned to the Western Front. He described the Battle of the Bulge not as a crisis rescued by any single commander, but as a triumph of the combined Allied armies under Eisenhower's supreme direction. He spoke of American valor in the snow, of British steadfastness on the northern shoulder, of Canadian and French contributions. Then, with deliberate emphasis, he addressed the recent controversy without ever naming Montgomery. "Let me say this about the Battle of the Ardennes," he declared, his voice rising. "It was primarily an American battle. It was an American fighting victory, made possible by the courage and endurance of the American soldier. The British forces played an indispensable part in restoring the situation, but the brunt of the fighting was borne by our American allies. No one understands this better than Field Marshal Montgomery himself, who has repeatedly paid tribute to the magnificent fighting qualities of the American troops." The Commons erupted in cheers. Churchill's words were masterful. Generous to the Americans, protective of Montgomery, and above all, unifying. He concluded with a ringing affirmation of the Anglo-American partnership, "A brotherhood in arms which will carry us to final victory," and sat down amid prolonged applause. The speech crossed the Atlantic overnight. American newspapers the next morning carried it on front pages. Churchill praises U.S. role in Bulge. PM, it was an American victory. Editorials that had demanded Montgomery's scalp softened. In Washington, Marshall cabled Eisenhower, "Crisis contained, for now." At Schaeff, Eisenhower read the transcript with profound relief. Churchill had done what he could not, publicly rebalance the narrative without humiliating a senior commander. Eisenhower immediately issued his own statement echoing the Prime Minister, emphasizing that All credit belongs to the soldiers of all nations who fought together. He also quietly restored full command of the 1st and 9th Armies to Bradley's 12th Army Group, ending the temporary arrangement weeks earlier than originally planned. Bradley, in Namur, received the news of Churchill's speech and Eisenhower's order with quiet satisfaction. He summoned his staff, opened the drawer, and tore up the resignation letter without ceremony. "It's over," he told Allen. "The men will get the recognition they deserve." He never spoke publicly of the episode, but those close to him noticed a subtle hardening, a wariness toward British headquarters that had not existed before. Montgomery learned of Churchill's speech through Brooke and accepted it with outward grace. Privately, he felt betrayed. "I only told the truth," he confided to de Guind. "Now the Prime Minister has rewritten it for political reasons." Yet he understood the necessity. On January 13th, he sent a personal signal to Eisenhower. "I fully support everything that has been said. My only desire is to serve you and the Allied cause." He also wrote warm letters to Hodges and Simpson, praising their cooperation. Publicly, he fell silent on the subject. Eisenhower responded with equal warmth, but followed it with a private directive. Montgomery was to clear all future press statements through SHAEF. The Field Marshal's operational freedom remained intact for the coming Rhine crossings, but his public voice was now constrained. British influence in strategic planning diminished subtly. American proposals carried greater weight in the final months. Montgomery would command the northern thrust into Germany with distinction, but the easy camaraderie of 1944 was gone. The scar tissue formed quickly. American commanders became more guarded in their dealings with British staff. Joint planning meetings grew formal, minutes taken meticulously. Patton continued his private tirades against Montgomery, though tempered now by victory. Soldiers on both sides returned to the fight. There was still a war to win, but the shared triumph of the Bulge carried a lingering bitterness. In the end, no one was relieved, no armies redeployed in anger, no public breach announced. The alliance held pushed forward, crossed the Rhine in March, and met the Soviets at the Elbe in April. Germany surrendered unconditionally on May 8th. The war in Europe ended in victory.